You have already died today. Not dramatically, not in the way you fear, but the you that existed yesterday with yesterday's thoughts, yesterday's worries, yesterday's version of the world no longer exists. Something changed. Something always changes. And yet, there is something in you that persists through all of these changes, that wakes up every morning with a sense of continuity, of being the same being that went to sleep. Now, the question that few dare to ask, what if death is just one more of these changes? What if what we call death is not the end of you, but simply the end of one version of you? I know the weight that question carries. Death is not abstract. It has a face. It has a name. It carries the scent of absence of someone you loved. The pain of loss is real, and it deserves to be felt completely. But there is a difference between the pain of losing someone and the terror that the loss is absolute, that the person you loved simply ceased to exist, like a flame extinguished by the wind. It is that belief, that silent assumption, that we want to examine today, because it may not be true, and if it isn't, everything changes. Every night you go through something extraordinary that nobody calls death, but that looks very much like it. You close your eyes, and the consciousness that was here, thinking, planning, worrying, dissolves. The world you knew disappears. Your body goes still. Your social identity, your name, your problems, your responsibilities, all of it fades away for hours. And then you enter the dream, and there another world exists with its own rules, its own experiences, sometimes just as vivid as this one. Then you wake up, and the cycle begins again. 3 completely different states of consciousness happening every single night, and in none of them do you cease to exist. Now, think about this carefully. In each of those states, reality feels different. Awake, you perceive the physical world through your senses. Dreaming, you perceive a world built entirely from within, without any direct external input. In deep dreamless sleep, there's no perception of any world at all, and yet you don't disappear. You return. Something persists through all of those states that does not depend on any of them to keep existing. Something more fundamental than whatever state you happen to be in. And now here's the part almost nobody considers. If you can move through 3 radically different states of consciousness every night without ceasing to exist, why would death be any different? But there is something even deeper. Physics tells us that nothing in the universe is ever truly destroyed. Energy doesn't disappear. It changes form. Matter doesn't vanish. It transforms. This is one of the most fundamental laws of nature, the conservation of energy, and it has never been violated in any known experiment. So why do we assume, without question, that consciousness, the most extraordinary phenomenon we know, would be the one thing in the universe capable of simply vanishing? Why would consciousness be subject to a different law than everything else that exists? Perhaps it isn't. Perhaps death is, like everything else in nature, not a destruction, but a transformation. What death clearly brings to a close is the biography, the name your parents chose for you, the role you've played in this specific world: son, daughter, father, mother, friend, professional. The memories accumulated over decades, the habits, the fears, the preferences, the scars. Everything we call personality, identity, the self, has an expiration date, and that is real. That ends. But the question few allowed themselves to ask is that what you truly are? Or is it simply the costume you wore during this particular experience? Think about who you were at 5 years old, the fears you carried, the certainties you held, the way you perceived the world. That child was you, and at the same time, you barely recognize yourself in them. The personality has changed so much that if they were someone else, you wouldn't know them on the street. But something persisted, something that accompanied every one of those transformations without getting lost in any of them. Jung called it the self, the deepest instance of the psyche, the one that never confuses itself with the roles it plays. The Vedic teachings called it Atman. The Buddhist traditions pointed toward something similar when they said that the ego is a construction, but that the consciousness observing the ego is not constructed. It simply is. And now here's the part almost nobody considers. If you have already lived through so many deaths of versions of yourself throughout your life and kept on existing through all of them, then perhaps physical death is simply the most radical of those transitions. The end of the longest biography you've ever lived, but not the end of the biographer, not the end of whoever was having the experience. The story ends. But the one who was reading the story perhaps turns the page. Imagine that everything you call reality reaches you through a series of filters, eyes that only capture a tiny fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum, ears that only perceive a narrow band of sound frequencies, a nervous system that translates everything into linear narrative, into cause and effect, into past and future. Those filters are not reality. They are your window into it. And like every window, they show only a portion of what exists on the other side. Perhaps death is simply the moment that window closes. But closing a window does not destroy what was outside. It only changes what you can see from where you were standing. But there is something even deeper. Near-death experience accounts, documented by serious researchers in verifiable clinical settings, consistently describe an expansion of perception, not a contraction. People who report seeing more, feeling more, understanding more, at a moment when, by all physical measures, they should be experiencing absolutely nothing. Haimong Moody, who studied more than 1,000 cases over decades, observed patterns so consistent that he began publicly questioning the materialist model of consciousness. We are not talking about isolated anecdotes. We are talking about a pattern that repeats across cultures, languages, and entirely different contexts. And that always points in the same direction. Consciousness does not end. It expands. And now, here's the most important part. If consciousness is what perceives, and not the instrument through which it perceives, then removing the instrument does not remove the consciousness. It removes only one specific way of perceiving, like a musician who loses the violin, but remains a musician, like a writer who loses the notebook, but still carries stories within the instrument was the tool. It was not the source, and the source, perhaps, does not need the instrument to keep existing. It simply needs a new instrument. Or perhaps it discovers that without the instrument, it perceives in ways the instrument never allowed. If you don't end at death, fear changes shape. Not necessarily disappears, but changes, because most of what we call the fear of death is not the fear of an experience. It is the fear of nothing. The terror of ceasing to be, of vanishing completely, of everything you ever lived, felt, loved, and built simply dissolving into the void. But what if that terror is built on a false premise? If consciousness doesn't end, but simply changes channel, then what exactly were you afraid of? But there is something even deeper. And this is where the investigation stops being theoretical and becomes personal. The way you live is directly tied to what you believe about death. If you believe you have only this time, this body, this specific life, then the urgency makes sense. The accumulation makes sense. The need for control makes sense. The entire architecture of modern fear makes sense. But if you are something moving through a human experience rather than a human experience that is going to end, then life stops being a race against time and starts feeling much more like a conscious choice of how to inhabit this particular state of consciousness for as long as it lasts. And now here's the part almost nobody considers. Death, understood as transition, does not diminish the value of life. It transforms it. Like a work of art, is temporary, but that because of that, you look at more carefully, with more presence, with more gratitude for every detail. Not because it will last forever, but because it is, right now, exactly what it is. Rumi wrote that death is a wedding with eternity, not a loss, an arrival. And perhaps what shifts when you truly absorb this is not what you do with your life, but the quality of attention with which you live it. Bring this inside for a moment, not as a concept, as an experience. If you don't end at death, if what you are persists, beyond the biography, beyond the name, beyond the body, then who are you right now in this moment? Not the role you play, not the story you tell about yourself, not the fears you carry or the plans you make. Who is what lies beneath all of that? Because that is the question that death, understood as transition, places back at the center of life. Not how much time do I have, but who is having this time? And that question, when taken seriously, has the power to reorganize everything. The priorities, the relationships, what you choose to build, what you choose to release. And here we arrive at something that is not only spiritual, it is deeply practical. If you don't end at death, life stops being urgency and becomes presence. I don't have the final answer, and be skeptical of anyone who claims they do. What I have is a question that, if you allow it, might change the way you wake up tomorrow morning. If you don't die, how does that change the way you live right now? If this video touched something in you, a doubt, a recognition, something you don't yet have a name for, leave it in the comments. It doesn't need to be an answer. It can be just a word. Sometimes naming the question is already the beginning of the expansion. Like the video, if you feel this kind of investigation is worth carrying forward. And if you haven't subscribed yet, consider it not to receive certainties, but to keep questioning alongside people who have chosen not to accept the surface of things. Consciousness is expanding, and you are here